Hello and welcome to the Fintech Finance Virtual Arena. Today we're going to be discussing the very future of fintech and its role in helping people and businesses, mainly SMEs, into the future. Now joining me, I have some absolutely brilliant guests here today. First up, we have Alex Reddish from Tribe. Alex, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you very much. Yeah, keeping sane.
Alex, could you give our audience a bit of background to yourself and to Tribe, please?
Yeah, so Alex Reddish, I'm Chief Commercial Officer for Tribe. I've done this in various guises for 9-10 years now, but Tribe is a payments processor predominantly focused on the fintech space and enabling the sort of new generation of fintechs across both the issuing and acquiring spectrum of services.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. Well, next up, we have Coconut's Mai Yamaguchi. Mai, thank you also for jumping into the arena here with us today. Could I also get you to give a bit of background to Coconut for our audience, please?
Sure. So my name is Mai. I'm a product manager at Coconut, and Coconut is a smart accounting tool for self-employed people. So we use open banking to connect with banking providers in the UK, providing insights about finances to self-employed.
Absolutely brilliant. Well, thank you very much for jumping in with us today. And lastly, to find out if fintech can go boldly where no bank has gone before, we have Manu Saadia, the author of Trekonomics. Manu, thank you also for joining us here today. I'm really excited to see your input when it comes to the future of this technology. So could you tell our audience a bit of background to yourself as well, please?
I am Manu Saadia, and I'm the author of Trekonomics, the economics of Star Trek. Available anywhere at on Amazon and others. And I'm a writer in Los Angeles, and I'm currently working on a science fiction project. So very much.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us here so early here today. I think the best way to kind of tackle these topics is to really set the scene, kind of take a step back. So, I mean, with that in mind, Alex, could I get you to give us, the defining characteristics of specifically maybe business banking for SMEs for the last couple of years?
Yeah, I think if you look at it as a decade, predominantly it was a forgotten phenomenon. If we look at 2010, it was an afterthought in the banking industry, predominantly because it was much more difficult to monetize. I think it's become a recognized avenue of focus for financial institutions over the past 5 years. You can maybe pinpoint some of that start to the inception of the payment system regulator in 2015 and some of the work they've been doing around democratization and sort of co-opetition, if that's the right technical term.
Yeah.
But I think it's becoming such an ever more important part of society. I don't want to get too detailed on vaccines and viruses too early in this conversation, but you've got to think that the general populace will be focusing on SMEs and sole traders, and that opportunity has to become more and more evident and ultimately important for society as we continue on.
Yeah, especially within Europe, we've seen that SMEs have really provided kind of a backbone to the economy that maybe a lot of industry and experts and banks hadn't even thought of. So, Mai, I'm also really interested to get your perspective on this. Coming from Coconut, what did you see as the defining characteristics of business banking for the last decade then? And how do you think that's changed as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, so mostly, SMEs have kind of distinct needs both from retail customers and corporate clients, but banks have kind of traditionally neglected their needs because it simply hasn't been profitable. So, a lot of the traditional banks have massive kind of compliance teams and lots of manual processes, and for them as small business haven't really been their focus, and so. When the pandemic hit, we saw a lot of the major banks stopping kind of accepting the new business customers. And at the same time, we saw a lot of actually people start up their own business during the pandemic, either because of job losses or, because they've had time to kind of think about what they want to do. And so, it's kind of a lot of the sort of opportunities coming out in the self-employed market that hasn't been picked up that fintech companies are, starting to address.
Yeah, I think that's such an important segment of the world that really just has not been addressed. So, Alex, if I could bounce back to you again, have you seen other ways that fintech has maybe kind of remedied some of those issues that you two brought up just then?
I think the the general proliferation of fintech has meant that there's always been a distinct focus on niche as opposed to, so we focus on how we can enable the few as opposed to the many. And across the spectrum of fintech, therefore, we've managed to deliver some great use cases for the SME, for that sort of younger business. I think there's obviously great product opportunity. Merchant cash advance has been a crappy product for years, and fintech's doing a long way to enabling affordable credit and things like that. You've got open banking. I'm not going to be the expert on this panel to talk about open banking, but the principle of the loans that were dispersed through the vaccine, all of these sorts of things, the ability to disperse money quicker, to manage credit lines quicker. There's definitely been a huge product growth in terms of how we can serve the SME. I think there's still a very big case for the underbanked and those that are necessarily able to obtain those services. But you have to say that fintech's been a massive improving metric on how SMEs interact with financial services.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's fair to say one of the biggest issues has, especially for SMEs, has been cash flow. Getting paid on time, which is such a significant issue that no one really talks about. Manu, could I get your perspective on this? We talk about the kind of scarcity of money being the biggest issue for a lot of SMEs. So, why has this been an issue, and how do you think we could remedy that going forward by using potential fintech going forward?
The way I look at it when I examined the economics of Star Trek, it's a world where the circulation of money sort of dropped down to almost zero, precisely because the necessity to have a pricing system for commodities is no longer necessary. So what Star Trek imagines is a world where automation and the general availability of things and services is so widespread and abundant that the necessity to price so as to manage scarcity is no longer there. In discussions like these, have often been asked whether, for instance, immaterial money or dematerialized money, or things like Bitcoin, digital currency, are things that are used in the future, specifically in the future of Star Trek. And I'm sort of unclear about the concept because, a lot of things have escaped at least in that imaginary world, a lot of things have escaped the reach of the market or the necessity to have a market for them. Now, that's the imaginary world of Star Trek and the sort of the endpoint of the Industrial Revolution and the Automation Revolution, as we could characterize it. In the real world, it's obvious that this is not what's going on, and in the real world, it is also obvious that dematerialization of money and the circulation and the instantaneous circulation of money is something very important. And we still rely on pricing, and we still rely on markets to actually manage our own scarcity.
Following on from that point, Mai, would you agree technologies like digital currencies could effectively enable and cash flow to be kind of sped up and get the money into SMEs' hands in a far more effective way than maybe traditional currencies and fiat currencies have done in the past?
So at Coconut, we're definitely seeing, lots of self-employed people having issues with, invoices and cash flow and managing that. Actually, we think that, the solution to that is not necessarily cryptocurrencies, but around sort of enabling more insights and empowering self-employed people to take control of their finances by, surfacing kind of the right insights and automating a lot of the manual processes that's involved in running a business. For example, we can have automated invoice chasing, for example, manage that as sort of paper admin in a more automated way.
Interesting. So that's one of the more exciting parts of payments and fintech for me, having this kind of transparent, invisible, highly tracked kind of payment chain. So I mean, we're going to start seeing maybe potentially by digitizing these payments, embedded finance becoming far more easily and availably used for a lot of SMEs, potentially like being able to access loans and accounts through various different apps. So Alex, do you think that open finance is actually on the horizon, or is it going to be just another buzzword that is going to be tossed around by a lot of fintechs and banks, and the banks just aren't going to pick it up?
I think the principle of open finance is ultimately a byproduct of what embedded finance, keep adding to the buzzwords. So I think that the ideology of embedded finance and ultimately the payment or the payment information being a background consequence of an action, I think is definitely going to happen. And I think, we as consumers, irrelevant of whether talking about an SME, we as a user expect a lazy, simplistic, data-rich experience now. And I think therefore actually the embedded finance piece therefore allows an open finance, an open life-like experience, because fundamentally the tools that we require to maintain that lazy lifestyle that we've all come to learn and love require that level of information, require that level of simplicity. So horribly, it's probably a byproduct of me sitting on my bum for too many hours.
Well, isn't that a brilliant way to phrase it? Innovation through laziness. But, always finding the quickest route.
My school report.
Well, with that in mind, then, Manu, if we're seeing this increase in innovation, particularly being picked up by fintechs, insurtechs, to satisfy the needs of SMEs going forward, do you think we're going to see a decrease amount of innovation coming from the traditional banks as these fintechs keep taking up small, large pockets, but just gradually of market share going forward?
Oh, they're all going to buy them if they're still around. I mean, it seems obvious also that banks themselves have sort of almost outsourced the innovation part of the business. These are such convenient tools, right? And people want them and people use them on their own. They download the apps and all that. So in the end, the banks are going to buy. The banks that survive the disruption are probably going to forge alliances. And it's going to be, the same way after World War II, bank offices everywhere in our cities started to appear, and then ATMs. This is going to be the same thing. It's the natural way of how innovation becomes pedestrian.
Interesting. So, Alex, I mean, do you agree with Manu there in this the sense that the banks are pretty much, the nail is already in the coffin because of this innovation that we've already seen before?
No. So I was trying to think about, as Manu was talking there, I was trying to think about that. I think if we're trying to make predictions as such, I think if you look at what the CMA 9 used to be, I think one of those will be represented. I'm talking from a UK perspective, Manu. My LA banking knowledge is slightly diminished, I'm sorry. But, the CMA 9, I think, will have a neobank in it within the next 10 years. I think it will, one of the core incumbent providers will fall away from that. I'm not saying they'll die a death. I think those that don't innovate, those that don't partner, I would question the acquisition model now, just on the basis that cash is cheap, investment's rich, and actually everyone can almost raise in their own right. But I think I do think there's an opportunity for a neobank to be successful, and ultimately for those incumbents that don't focus on technology to fall by the wayside. It's what partnership wins, right? And I think that's ultimately what Manu's saying in some guys, is that you're not going to win this on your own anymore. There has to be people best in class through the value chain that allows you to win.
Yeah, I can completely imagine. And we're seeing such specific fintechs coming about that are pinpointing complete niches in the market that I think we're going to see just an era of partnership. Now, with that in mind, Mai, if I could come to you in terms of talking about specific client bases and using the technology behind that, what do you think will be some of the biggest general technologies we see used in fintechs and for SMEs going forward, do you think AI is going to really? I mean, I know it's been prevalent for the last couple of decades, but do you think it's really going to come into its own this decade?
Absolutely. So the opportunities that we have analyzing data and applying that to automate the things that small businesses need to do is absolutely massive, and it hasn't even been kind of tapped into yet. And especially we're really excited about open banking and what that would bring. So, it's still in sort of very emergent stages, and the execution of it, I think, is there's a lot to be improved. But we're able to kind of instigate payments from outside the bank and kind of act as kind of a source point for different data inputs. There's like something really powerful we can do there that would really help small businesses to help their lives.
Just to come on top of that, I think the other thing that not necessarily technological advancement is the sort of marketplace principle that will form in a lot of individual applications. Like, I think if you look east and the value of the super app, Revolut would say that they're trying to do that, but I don't think that's really been conquered in the B2B world. And the idea that Starling have created in terms of, and Coconut to some extent in terms of the aggregation of additional services, and therefore providing a centralized interface for me as an SME, I think that will become more and more commonplace, and the innovation will happen around that in terms of the products that feed into it.
The idea of having this giant, as you say, super app, this platform that can do everything is, well, to me, I don't know if this is just because I'm lazy as well, but just having that convenience to be able to, I lived in China, and being able to order my train ticket from my effective WhatsApp was game changing. Manu, from your perspective over in the States, obviously now those applications, specifically the Chinese super apps, have pretty much been demolished by a recent presidential order. What do you think?
As many of these presidential orders, nothing happened.
Yeah, well, so with that in mind, do you think that we're going to continue to see that platformification be really strong in Asia and maybe not so strong in America? Or do you think just because we've now seen maybe those Chinese super apps take a hit, maybe we're going to start seeing some American competition in terms of creating these one platform to rule them all, really?
I mean, the one-stop shop is a great model because it's very convenient as well, and with integrating and federating a lot of services together. I think there's one that's a little bit like that in the US already, and that's very much used, and it's QuickBooks, Intuit, and they integrate. I mean, they have a lock on the tax market and the tax filing market. Because they're very good lobbyists. And so now, they manage payroll, they manage taxes, they manage, pretty much all aspects of your financial life if you let them. So there is a super app of that kind. It's not very glamorous and it's not very exciting, but it's what every small business in the US, I mean, even I'm just a writer, I use it. So to invoice, to record my expenses, to do my taxes, and everything's in one place, and it's connected to all my other accounts. So I don't have to download 20 different apps. So it does exist. It's sneaky, but it does exist. They even offer short-term loans and things like that. So they really have cornered the market already. And they offer a model for, I believe what's to come in that space. Yes.
I think the only thing to consider against that is the people's, this is not, criticism, so I agree. I think the problem we have as companies in this market now is people's understanding of the value of their data and their ability to retrench that. Like you look at Signal, right, or Telegram, or one of these guys this week. I think Telegram surpassed 500 million users last week, and that's because everyone realized that WhatsApp were feeding their data to Facebook, and there will be this constant battle now, I think, and it will be a consumer-led cliff edge, whereby you try to provide enough product that the consumer uses it and not too much that they retrench themselves from sharing their data.
Yeah.
And it's in the case, I mean, it's very true, that we in the US, we basically sign away the rights to our data to companies like Facebook, but also like Intuit, because they do have connection to our bank accounts and all our, and the regulation is not transparent to the end user and to citizens in general.
Going forward then, May, could I ask, with all these, various different technologies being implemented onto these platforms, we always hear, especially within the fintech industry, so many buzzwords. We had, the Internet of Things. To an extent, I wanted to almost throw open banking under the bus here. I know that's not a technology; it's more of a movement. What do you think will be probably the biggest kind of marketing kind of chat when it comes to improving technology and offerings for SMEs?
I think open banking and PSD2 has kind of opened up people's minds about sort of what's possible with the infrastructure in place, and we're still kind of going through the stages of kind of getting the traditional banks on board with that and executing it in a way that is it was intended. But like sort of a machine learning and data, and it's been talked about for a long time until sort of people's kind of mindsets kind of caught up and actually being kind of ready to sort of utilize the real value of it. I think there's kind of a learning curve with open banking as well, and we're just kind of going through that learning curve. And by the end of the decade, I think we'll see much more kind of opportunities and ways of using it that we can't even imagine now.
A lot of fintechs said that they were using AI in the last decade, and when actually, obviously, they'd been using it for a long time, but maybe they weren't using it as to the extent that they were talking about. Do you think there's going to be any kind of similar technologies as that?
Yeah, I think it's difficult as you transition through the decade. We released a report middle of last year, and actually, when you looked at what we predicted 10 years ago would be prevalent in technology now, we were way off, right? So. Yeah. I'm guessing, there are more qualified people on this call than me to say that we really don't have a clue. I think the machine learning and AI will actually become a proper reality, not a tagline on an investor deck or something like that. We actually, I don't know if I can tell, I'm going to tell this anyway. So we joined the Microsoft Startup Program beginning of this year. And we're currently working on things like GTP3 and understanding what they can do in terms of their access to AI and machine learning, and it's a proper reality, right? Like it's something that's well above my pay grade or my intellect. But I think it's things like that will become much more interesting. Distributed ledger technology, blockchain, these are buzzwords now, but you can see a roadmap to applicability. So I think, why don't we all get back on 5 years' time and see how off we are now, and then we'll probably still be off in 5 years' time after that.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there when you brought in the blockchain example. We heard so many banks look into use cases, and obviously, the kind of the time it takes to action those is a long time, but maybe we haven't seen it so much, and maybe we will in 5 years. Manu, could I throw it to you then in the first instance? Do you think we're gonna? Yeah, you've already talked about maybe the banks kind of like being going the way of the dinosaurs, but maybe in the more shorter term, do you think we're going to see fintechs continually to grab market share, but just in increasingly niche operations for SMEs?
That sounds like a reasonable prediction, but again, as Alex was saying, we've been wrong so many times in the past that the way technology tends to work is that it creates new needs. So with new tools, new needs, and new needs for services tend to arise. So I would say that it's a reasonable prediction. But again, I was reminded of that 10 years ago when Bitcoin came on the scene. Everybody was like, blockchain, blockchain, blockchain. But blockchain seemed to have been a solution in search of a problem. That's where I fall on this question.
Yeah, and Alex, 5 years ago, people insisted that banks were finished, and the fintechs would rule the roost. Now, it doesn't quite look like that. We've talked about partnerships and how important partnerships have been for the last couple of years. But with the pandemic, with an increasingly digital society, are we going to start looking, even in the short term, at a more fintech-heavy financial services market?
From a consumer perspective, yes. From an underlying infrastructure perspective, I'm not sure. I think there's a disintermediation between where we trust someone to hold our money and where we want to interact with on a daily basis. If you take the premise of fintech, is it the UX UI led that enables the consumer, or is it the underlying technology? I think there's an argument as to where fintech sits within the value chain, and actually, therefore, I think the banks will retain their balance sheet, but that's probably not enough, because the 123 account used to lose Santander a fortune, and then they used to have to cross-sell you a mortgage and insurance. That business model falls away. So I think a bank would retrench from offering the service if it couldn't find a vehicle to monetize it elsewhere.
It is interesting hearing about how it's kind of already happened and where it will go in the future. Well, thank you all three of you for joining me here today. I think that's all we have time for. And to all our viewers, thank you very much as well. You can catch the rest of the series and much more on our site, and of course YouTube and LinkedIn, where I'll see you there.